Good evening, everyone, and welcome to Café Muse's 2024 annual DC Area Literary Translators Program, or DC Alt for short. Thank you to Michael Davis for sharing your classical guitar with us, and to Dan Morano for the photo slideshow. I'm Luther Jet, and I'll be co-hosting this evening along with Barbara Goldberg. In a few minutes, Barbara will introduce our featured poet translators, Jonah Colson, reading from Allah Waters, his translation of Uruguayan poet Miguel Avero's work, and Marguerite Fetrovitz, reading from her translation of Chilean poet Ennio Montero, Night. We've left enough time in our one-hour program for Barbara to lead a brief Q&A after their readings. A few housekeeping items before we begin. During the reading, you may use the chat feature to comment or ask questions for the poets to answer during the Q&A. Unfortunately, we're not always able to get to all of the questions, but we do welcome them all. We've muted your microphones, so the inevitable sounds of dogs barking, cats meowing, doorbells ringing will not interrupt the program. Please bear with us if we encounter a technical glitch. We'll be right back. Should you have difficulty hearing the poets, you can use Zoom's closed caption feature. To use it, look for a gray box at the bottom of your screen labeled CC. Click on it. Then choose Show Subtitles, and closed captions will appear at the bottom of your screen. We encourage you to buy our poets' books. We'll put a link in the chat later that will send you to the site where you can do just that. Café Muse is a nonprofit organization with an all-volunteer team. We encourage you to donate to Café Muse in support of its literary programs, and we will put a donation link in the chat as well. Barbara Goldberg, poet and translator, is the author of 8 books, including her most recent, Breaking and Entering New and Selected Poems. She is also the translation editor for WordWorks International Editions. Please welcome Barbara Goldberg.
Hi, everyone. Good evening. And I'm glad to see so many people here for this translation reading, which is once a year through Café Muse. And it's through the DC Literary Translators Network. I think we put in network. I don't know why, to distinguish us from something else. Anyway, as translation editor for the WordWorks over the last 10 or so year, I've selected poetry manuscripts really from places I'd like to go, like ancient Greece and Croatia and Kurdistan, which doesn't exist. And this year we're coming out with a book from the Persian. So the crazy thing is, why do people like to travel? I mean, is it to gain insight into different cultures, mindsets, and languages? All this expands our consciousness, not just as people, but as writers, which is why so many writers love to translate. And the two readers here tonight are translators, but also authors in their own right. And I know that people would want to know, why would people choose to translate over creating their original work? And I would assume it's because they like to travel too. And you can ask them why. And it seems that we have 2 Spanish translators here tonight. And it's interesting because one of them is a poet, that's Jonah Colson, and the other, Marguerite Feitlowitz, is a fiction writer. And they're both very distinguished. So let me just get to it and say that Jonah Colson is the author of a book that won a prize, his first book, and he's also the translator of Miguel Avero's Waters. which you'll be reading from, and I think we'll be hearing from him too. Jonah is from the Washington Writers Publishing House. He teaches in Maryland, but he lives in DC. And perhaps you'd like to introduce Miguel and say a few words about him.
Yes, thank you. Thank you to Café Muse. Thank you to Barbara. Thank you to DC Alt for inviting me here this evening. I'm very happy to share the poems from Aguas, which I'm going to be reading from this evening. So yeah, that would be great, actually. A little bit about Miguel Rivera. I'll just read the bio that's on the back of the book. He's a poet, narrator, essayist, teacher, and researcher whose work has been translated into English and French, though English was the first one by me, just saying. He writes literary reviews for the Weekly Brecha and has appeared in various national and international anthologies. He's published over 10 books. When he was here and visiting, we counted over 10 books. And he also directs a writing workshop in Uruguay called Puerto Quimera, which is very, very interesting workshop. But he's a wonderful teacher, a wonderful human, and a wonderful poet. And it's been just such a pleasure to be able to translate his work and give it an audience, an English-speaking audience. This is his first full-length book in English. So I'm very happy to share that with you this evening. So I guess I'll just get started. I'm going to set my timer, which I should have done before, but off we go. So I'm just going to read a little bit from the introduction. Perhaps I'm taking away some questions, possibly, but I know it's kind of curious, and I always ask this. How did you come to be matched up with this poet? How do you know this poet? Living poet, contemporary poet. He's, about 5 years younger than me. So, we're both alive and writing. So when I was taking a writers conference at the Gettysburg College from the Gettysburg Review, which is now defunct, unfortunately,
Wow.
I was taking a workshop with the poet Sidney Wade. Wonderful. We were talking, and I have a bachelor's degree in Spanish. I'm not a native Spanish speaker. I learned it. And it's always been a huge passion of mine from a very early age, since middle school. And she said that her friend was editing a book of younger Uruguayan poets, Jesse Lee Cuchervo, who's out of the University of Wisconsin at Madison, who's exquisitely prolific and exquisitely kind and generous. And she's really brought a lot of Uruguayan literature into English language audiences. And she connected me with Jesse Lee, and I sent her, we had some correspondence, and she said, hey, yeah, let's do this. And she matched me with Miguel Avero, and he sent me his first book as a PDF. And I had to translate 10 to 15 poems for the anthology that she was working on, which is called America Invertida, Younger Uruguayan Poets, which came out from the University of New Mexico Press a few years ago. And I just so enjoyed translating that I kept going. So I asked him for his second book, and he sent me his second book. And that became Aguas. So Aguas is a collection of his first two poetry collections. I kind of did a collection with a new title for his first book in English. But I welcome any questions during question and answer time. I'll be happy to chat about it. So let me just get into reading. I'm going to read a few poems, of course, from Aguas, which turned out like this. We love the cover. It's a beautiful cover. And I see the fabulous Grace Cavalieri here. And we did a Poet in the Poem from the Library of Congress when Miguel was visiting, and it was such a highlight and just such an absolute joy. So I'm very happy to read from it. And he had a wonderful time here in DC. I played tourist and translator for almost 2 weeks, and it was good. It was a lot of fun. I went to places I hadn't been in years. So okay, now to the poems. His poems, so the title is called Aguas because there's waters all through his work. There's the water on the outside, right? The physical water, but also kind of the water on the inside, right? I mean, we're like 75, 80% water, maybe more. And he kind of talks about, the metaphorical water that kind of runs through our lives, as well as the physical water that also affects our moods and affects our life so much. And so it was a really apt title. And you'll hear that many of his poems often have water or humidity or currents or waves or something concerning an ocean, right? So water permeates all through this book. So if you like to go to the beach, this would be a wonderful beach read, okay? Because you'll be there by the waters. I'm gonna start with La Pieza, which is kind of the center poem of the second half of the book. The book is broken into two parts. His first book, selected works from his first book called Arca de Azarin, which means sawdust ark, very interesting. And his second book, La Pieza, which means the room. So it's divided into selected works from two of his first books. So what I'm going to attempt to do here is I want Miguel to read um, his first few poems first. I have recordings of him reading, and then I will offer the translation. And I'll maybe might talk a little bit in between if time allows. So let's start with a poem called La Pieza, which means the room.
Buenas tardes. Leo para ustedes el poema La pieza. Hace algunos años pinté de gris la habitación. Tallé las gotas con el martillo de Dufresne. Hoy todos los desagües mueren en la ventana sur. Veo el casamiento de los zorros y el cielo de Teilier. Pero también algunas veces, en sonámbulos descuidos pude ver el sol. Hoy lo tapo con un dedo.
So this is the room. Some years ago, I painted the room gray. I carved the drops with the hammer of Dufresne. Today, all the drains die in a south window. I see the wedding of the foxes and the sky of Teilier. But also, sometimes, in sleepwalking carelessness, I could see the sun. Today, I cover it with a finger. The next poem I'm going to read is, you guys get a special treat because I almost did not include this in the translation, in the book, because it loses a lot. Translation, I find, in my humble opinion, that translation cannot capture everything, right? You're giving a rendering of the original. And many people, many poets, many translators would argue that you're actually writing a new poem. I don't know if I see it as a new poem, but I see it as the best poem from the original. And this one loses a wordplay here, which I just want to briefly establish. So this poem is called Zorita and Dante. Zorita is a very famous Chilean poet, very, very popular in South America. He wrote poetry and prose, and he was very, very heavily influenced by Dante, who wrote the Inferno, right? So what you have in the original, the poem is called Zorita and Dante. But what you have in the original is Zorita and Dante means walking, right? So, but you can't get that wordplay in the translation. And so I was like, you know what? I'm going to leave this in here as the best copy of the original and be able to, hopefully people can understand and hear that wordplay in the original Spanish and how it translates as just walks in the translation. But in Spanish, it's Zorita and Dante, which means Zorita walks. But in the translation, it translates as Zorita walks, but it loses that play on words. Here, Miguel.
Comparto ahora el poema Zurita Andante, y tiene un epígrafe de Raúl Zurita que dice: pero pasó que estaba en un baño cuando vi algo como un ángel. Asciende hacia la luz, Zurita andante, pule los escalones, Zurita andante, hiede hipoclorito, Zurita andante, pantalón con lamparones, Zurita andante, divisa el color rojo, Zurita andante, lucha con las manchas, Zurita andante, y el aliento de los caños, Zurita andante, escribe un poema, Zurita andante, canta los azulejos, Zurita andante, en el baño de mujeres, Zurita andante, engrameando la tiesta, Zurita andante, descubre las virtudes, Zurita andante, ya no tendrás sueños, Zurita andante.
So you hear that Zorita and Dante. It's wonderful. So again, Zorita was very heavily influenced by Dante, read him as a child, was recited his poems. Zorita and Dante. Ascending toward the light, Zarita walks. Polishing the steps, Zarita walks. Stinking of Clorox, Zarita walks. With stained pants, Zarita walks. Seeing red, Zarita walks. Fighting with stains, Zarita walks. And smelling like drains, Zarita walks. Writing a poem, Zarita walks. Singing to the tiles, Zarita walks. In the women's bathroom, Zarita walks. Shaking his head, Zarita walks. Discovering virtue, Zarita walks. No longer dreaming, Zarita walks. I'm going to go to another poem, translated called Found. And as been pointed out very astutely, it really has a lot of South American flavor of the literature of South America. It has this, kind of a quest for meaning. It has, the circular sort of identity here. And it's called Found. It kind of has this poetic structure. So let's hear Miguel first again.
Comparto lectura del poema Hallazgo. Encontré un hombre que recitaba un poema, de un poemario inconcluso su mejor poema, y vi que mientras lo recitaba lo componía, y sus palabras se escribían en mi cerebro, y salían de mi boca y de todos mis gestos, y mi voz resonaba en ese pequeño mundo solitario, donde yacía solo mi propio cuerpo, mi sola mente y mi poema, que hablaba sobre un hombre que encontraba otro, que era el mismo, recitando de su inconcluso poemario su mejor poema.
Found. I found a man who recited a poem from an unfinished book of poems, his best poem. And I saw that while he recited it, he composed it. And his words were written in my brain, and they came out of my mouth and all of my gestures. And my voice echoed in that little lonely world where only my own body lay, my lone mind and my poem that talked about a man who found another, that was himself reciting from his unfinished book of poems, his best poem. I think that's a really fun poem to read. I know all of these sound a lot better in Miguel's Spanish, so forgive me here. Next poem is called Choice, and it has a lot of imperatives here. So I had to be, as a translator, of course, verb and verb tense is something that you really are super aware of. And this was a little bit challenging in verb tense, but I just realized that it was mostly imperative, command. So it's called Choice.
Comparto ahora el poema Elección. Renunciar a ello o salir a confrontar. Calma o tempestad, ocaso o alba. Salir sin saber qué salía ni a qué. Y quién sabe qué fue lo que dejé con mi partida. Porque hoy cada bruma nos roza con sus labios. Y mañana los hirientes colmillos del sol desgarrarán la inutilidad de los paraguas. Abandonados, sobre este día abandonados, con pies para gritar la carretera, con palabras para derramar en un cuaderno, con pecados para enterrar bajo los árboles.
Choice. Give it up or go out and confront it. Calm or storm, sunset or dawn. Go out without knowing I was going out or why. And who knows what I left with my departure? Because today every mist rubs us with its lips, and tomorrow the hurtful fangs of the sun will tear apart the uselessness of umbrellas. Abandoned on this day, abandoned. With feet to crack the road, with words to spill in a notebook, with sins to bury under the trees. One of my favorite words in Spanish is paraguas, meaning umbrellas. I forget what it is in French.
Pluie.
Parapluie? Parapluie?
Pluie.
Yeah, so it means the same, right? Stop rain, which is so wonderful in so many other languages. It's just very direct. So I love that. Paraguas. Beautiful. I'll read two more poems for you. The next one, actually, I've never read from this book before, but Miguel likes it. and he recorded it for us. This one's called Hegemony. And I mean, I could talk about challenges with each of these poems as you translate, but believe me, I learned a lot of new vocabulary in translating a lot of these poems. So this poem is called Hegemony, and then we'll go back to one last poem. Hopefully, I get this one right. Pardon me. There we are. Hegemony.
Hegemonía. Lo que albergó nuestro corazón ayer fue perdiendo nitidez en la humedad. Antes de que el pecho se convirtiera en piedra, antes de que en nuestra boca se acumularan esas ruinas, la misma ventana apilaba otros momentos. Detenido en la distancia todo lo sublime, aquellos zapatos errantes en los que quisiéramos volver a estar, las viejas cicatrices olvidadas. No somos los mismos. Paredes que rodearon infinitos seres se alojan ahora amarradas en nuestro interior. El cielo nos observa como un desnudo abismo. El agua establece su hegemonía celeste.
Beautiful. So, just a side note, I studied Spain Spanish, Castellano, and so hearing him record these was an integral part of translation. I think probably maybe for Marguerite too, you know, Chilean has a separate accent, Argentina has a separate accent, Uruguay has a different accent, very similar to Argentina. But the j, you're the j, the Italian influence specifically, at least in Uruguay and Spanish, which is so beautiful, but I had to get a little accustomed to. Hegemony. What sheltered our heart yesterday has been losing sharpness in the humidity. Before our breast became stone, before our mouth accumulated those ruins, the same window piled up other moments. Everything sublime stopped in the distance, those shoes wandering where we would like to begin again, the old scars forgotten. We are not the same. Walls that surrounded infinite beings are not lodged, are not moored inside of us. The sky watches like an abyss, and the water establishes its celestial hegemony. All right, one more poem, and I'm going to read the title poem, Aguas. This was an amazing challenge to translate because of the syntax, the inversion, specifically of either verb, adverb, or where to find the pronoun, where to find the reference. This was a challenge to translate, but I think we got the best copy of the original. So this one's called Aguas, Waters.
Comparto el poema Aguas. Agua en la mañana alquitranada, o en la noche que cubre de cartones el amanecer. Agua en los tejados anidando. Agua en la explanada donde olvidaron sus agujeros negros las estrellas. Agua incesante, agua de a ratos. Agua en el reflejo que descubre el ojo en el espejo. Agua en la tinta de los versos que no se escribirán nunca. Agua rebasando el vaso frío y ahogado con una gota inestimable. Agua en el revuelto río de nuestra paz interior, donde jamás caminaremos, donde ni cenizas quedan. Agua acampando en torno al último fogón.
Aguas, waters. Water in the tar-dark morning, or the night that covers the sunrise with boxes. Water nesting on rooftops, water in the plaza where the stars forgot their black holes. Constant water, occasional water. Water in the reflection that discovers the eye in the mirror. Water in the ink of the verses that will never be written. Water overflowing the cold glass and drowned with a drop. Water in the troubled river, where we walk, where no ashes remain. Water settling around the last fire. Thank you all very much.
You know what I said to Jonah right before this program? If I had a right to ask a question, I would ask, why was the book title Waters as opposed to Water? And now that I hear the poem, there are many different kinds of waters in those poems. So that was really interesting. The other thing is you brought up so many, or this reading brought up so many interesting things. I don't know. There are a lot of translators in the audience, and I would reckon each one knows the relationship between translating, traduttore, traditore, translator, trader. And by the way, I don't know if you know where that originates from, 13th century. And it was the French, well, it was the Italians saying to the French, they did such a miserable job of translating Dante that they were being a traitor to the work as opposed to a translator. The difference between translator and traitor is one letter in Italian. So anyway, I kind of thought that was interesting that Dante even came up. And the other thing is that we're going to start with Marguerite Weitlowitz in a minute, but I just want to say that she's polyglot. She translates not just from the Spanish, but from the French as well. So that's double pandemonium. Marguerite is a literature professor emerita at Bennington College in Bennington, Vermont, and also the founder of the Bennington Translates, a multidisciplinary initiative spanning literary to humanitarian translations with a focus on forced displacement, migration, and justice. And I have to say, Marguerite, I've heard of many descriptions of translations programs, but I've never heard anything like this in terms of the focus and the fact that it's interdisciplinary. Maybe you'll get a chance to talk some about that. Among her awards are two Fulbrights to Argentina and a Harvard faculty research grant. And let's see, she is the author of A Lexicon of Terror, Argentina and Legacies of Torture, which was a New York Times notable book, and a finalist for the Penn LL Winship Prize. She also, I think from the French, translated a book by Lillian Atlan, Small Bibles for, what was it? For Terrible Times. Meryl's here, he can wince and shrug. Anyway, another interesting book translating, this time of poetry, I believe. And you've also translated memoirs and what else? The four, fiction, poetry, etc., etc. And I guess her latest translations are of the writer tell me if I'm getting this right, Ennio Mortadei. Say it, Marguerite. Come on.
Okay, you did great. It's Ennio Mortadei.
Yeah, that's who I meant. And she's
Yeah,
also
that's what I understood.
Good. Glad you can understand. And then you've also translated Valenzuela. Let's see, I'm getting stuff in here. Suzanne Valenzuela. And you've written an
Luisa
essay.
Valenzuela.
Say that again?
Luisa Valenzuela.
Luisa Valenzuela. And you've also written an essay on your own process of translation. And I'm glad we're getting into some of the complexities of translation, because that's why we love to translate. I think translators must be the most obsessive of writers, because you just keep mulling over in your mind what would be the very best way to say it. The other thing I want to say is Nabokov said that translation was impossible, that and he would look up every word in the dictionary or make his students look up every word. But on the other hand, he later said that the best mimic was the best translator. So I thought that was interesting too. Okay. So tonight you're going to read from Ennio, what's his name? Mortadei. And at some point, I'd like to ask you I'm so glad that you did have also translated erotic sonnets. But in any case, maybe we'll talk about that later. But why don't you give us some of, he wrote during the time of, he was inspired, this book, he's reading from Night. The poems are coming from Night, which was in reaction to the Pinochet thing in Chile. So that's why there's so much focus on how terrible it is to live in an authoritarian state.
Okay, thank you,
Okay.
Barbara. So yes, I'm going to read from this book of poems called Night. And the poet's name is Ennio Molteno, obviously an Italian name, though he's from Chile. He was the first generation. His parents were Chilean immigrants to the city of Valparaiso, which has always historically been an Italian enclave in Chile. Molteno was also, there are so many interesting connections here, a poet of the sea, wrote water and the sea, and that particular coastline goes all through all of his books. He wrote 8 collections of poems and some other volumes of different kinds of prose. He was also raised on Dante and Virgil, and he has poems to both of them. Just to be clear, just so we all know what the history is, Pinochet toppled Allende, democratically elected Salvador Allende in Chile on September 11th, 1973, ushered in a very dark period of Chilean history, disappearances of well over 3,000 people, a lot of torture centers, a lot of repression, and Pinochet would stay in power until 1989, 99, actually. And the constitution that was promulgated under Pinochet is still in force in Chile. That's worth mentioning for a number of reasons, not least because Molteno was obsessed with the law. And he has a number of poems that are actually about the law. And I have an essay called The Hollow Pillars of the Law, which takes its title from one of Molteno's poems. Night consists of, I want to say a couple of things. Here's the cover, and it is an image of a painting by Nemesio Antunes, a very great Chilean painter of the mid to late 20th century. Everything about this book is Chilean. The design, the typeface, the design of the letters, and that was at the wonderful insistence of my wonderful editor and publisher, Matvey Yankelevich of World Poetry Books. Molteno wrote his first book in lines, and then he delineated everything he ever wrote and never again wrote in verse. He didn't want to write texts that said, "Here I am, you can see I'm a poem." He was looking for cadences and a poetics that was more subtle. And so all of his poems are prose poems, and some of them consist of just one line. And we can talk, if anybody's interested, we can talk about the challenge of translating something that gives you absolutely no place to hide. Molteno can be a very blunt poet, very terse, and this book is in certain ways, which he never published during the dictatorship, I think a collection of exquisitely controlled rage. Jonah, you mentioned Raúl Zurita, very great Chilean poet, and of course Molteno and Zurita, basically the same generation, were very much aware of each other. And Zurita had this to say about Molteno. He said he is one of the finest, greatest, most curious, and honorable poets of Chile. So the other thing about Molteno is that he doesn't give his poems titles, but rather numbers. Okay? So I'll start with number 1. I'll read some of the poems in Spanish, though not all, in interest of time. Okay. 1. At what time must the birds lined up in gardens, trees, and cages sing? Look to the law. 1. ¿A qué hora deben cantar los pájaros formados en el jardín, en árboles o jaulas? Lea la ley. 2. Let's appoint the village madman, Chief Justice on the Court of Appeals with the vote and veto and seat at the table, a sane example to the debating powers that be and the people who in their hours of contemplation rest in chairs set out on the sidewalk when twilight bloodies the screen with scrolls and pictures to make us believe that, of course, here it is, the disgusting, fleshy finale. Let's appoint the village madman. 7. Definitive sentences do not appear in these pages unless they were previously published in the newspaper of record, as the law decrees, and horizons vanish. Yes. Si pones el oído sobre la tierra desnuda, escucharás claramente el nombre de los asesinos. 10. If you put your ear to the naked earth, you will precisely hear the murderers' names. 12. They have sent me to the bottom of the sea, without oxygen, of course, in street clothes, with blue envelope in hand. This is a poem that seems very surreal. It operates on a number of levels. To the bottom of the sea, of course, we know, it's well documented, that the Chilean Air Force took desaparecidos and dumped them living, but anesthetized, into the Atlantic Ocean. And so that's obviously what might be a first association. I was really puzzled by the blue envelope. It seemed to me just a brilliantly compelling, surreal image. But in fact, the blue envelope in Chile is like the pink slip here. It means you've been fired. And Moltedo was fired from his job as director of the University of Valparaiso Press, a place that he had led in really interesting directions for a number of years. So, 15. This is the title poem. Noche, from the Latin nox, from the Greek nyntos, descended in turn from the Sanskrit nocta. In German, one says Nacht, in English, night. Portuguese, noite, in French, nuit, in Catalan, nit, in Walloon, nut. In Chile, night is eternal. 21. Once you've been thrown out and good riddance, you can't go back home. Even when out of sight and out of mind, you set out again as an old man to go back to the place that gave you comfort, the country you called home. Because the country you called home has disappeared. 23. It's easy, plowing end to end, slitting the country end to end, back and forth, one furrow next to another, like bleachers in the stadium, as seen from the air, their traces sinking ever deeper, night and day, until they appear, until we hear their screaming. We're here, my darling, here. Here too is another image of the stadium. On the day of the coup, dissidents, protesters, people were rounded up and herded into the National Stadium, which was turned into a torture center and transit camp for those who made it out of the stadium alive, only to be brought to other prisons and camps far from the capital. 24. El corazón general no late, pero existe. Lo que podemos llamar, en momentos sentimentales, el corazón colectivo no es la suma de los corazones individuales. El corazón general es un artefacto único, y quien lo encuentra puede darse por muerto. 24. The general heart doesn't beat, though it exists. What we can call, in sentimental moments, the collective heart is not the sum total of individual hearts. The general heart is a unique artifact, and whoever finds it can consider himself dead. He does have a lighter side, as you'll see in 44. Protect me, God, from pedagogical meaning, and let each day surprise my sight with the breeze that blows in no style past the corner. 49. Good for you, Galileo. You escaped by a hair. Now, in November of 1992, you are officially vindicated. As for our Juan, his case is just getting started. With no papers or proofs, there's no possible hurry, but let's hope it doesn't take 500 years. Okay. 62. Giving and taking. I hold out to you a certificate of good conduct, and you make your confession. You whisper in my ear where they are to be found. There will be no reports in the press and no discussion in front of the children. All quiet. What is not known does not exist. But you'll be comforted to know that in the future, the surprise can be repeated as many times as may be necessary. As many times as may be necessary. 66. Un esqueleto más y quedaré hablando solo, comprando huesos, tocando la flauta, el tambor con huesos, presentando materiales, plantaciones, viveros, hasta el día de la cosecha y la gran exportación de tallos y huesos. 66. One more skeleton, and I'll be left talking to myself, buying bones, playing the flute, playing the drums with bones, pointing the way to fields, plantations, and nurseries until the day of the harvest and the great exportation of stems and bones. Just 2 more poems. 92. And what shall we do with all the love accumulated in distant countries? Return the ashes. 92. ¿Y qué haremos con todo el amor acumulado en países lejanos? Devolución de cenizas. Okay. This is the last poem I'll read. It's 113. It's the last poem in the collection. I'll read it first in Spanish and then in English. 113. Los esperamos en la orilla azul. Vengan de todos los rincones. Vengan traperos, santeras, gitanos, mendicantes, cuenteros, promocionantes, mandaderos, vergonzantes, pedigüeños, etc. El mar los desnuda y se lleva la mugre. 113. We wait for them on the blue shore. Let them come from every corner. Rag sellers, cure sellers, wandering tale tellers, ad runners, errand runners, the shamefaced, the abased, and etc. The sea washes them naked and carries away the slime. Thank you. Happy to take questions, of course. I'm sure, Barbara, you always have questions.
These works were very different. I'm wondering how a Chilean audience would respond to this work. Quite different from in America. We're so innocent. We don't know anything about this torture stuff. But,
Well, that's not true, Barbara. I think I'm going to argue back a little bit.
Go ahead.
I think I will. I think, let me take your point. I think that certainly, I think there's something kind of interesting though, that you say we don't know anything about it, and yet the CIA and a number of American corporations and banks bankrolled, and not only bankrolled, but especially in Chile, the CIA was instrumental to the coup. And it bankrolled all of the dictatorships in Argentina, in Uruguay, in Brazil, in Bolivia, in Chile, in the late 1960s and 1970s.
I will just say that Allende was murdered in Bethesda. Remember
No,
that?
he wasn't. No, Barbara. Allende took his life in the presidential palace called La Moneda because the army, the Navy was actually bombing the building and bombing all over in different parts of the country. He refused to let himself be taken alive, and he took his own life and made an incredibly powerful radio address just before he did that. So I just want to say that I think you're referring to something that did happen almost on the edges of Bethesda in Sheridan's Circle. It was the murder of Orlando Letelier, who was a diplomat, a Chilean diplomat, and in the car with him was an American woman named Ronnie Moffett. And that happened right in the middle of, you know, Massachusetts Avenue and Sheridan Circle. So and that was you know, really brazen, to put it mildly.
Lovely.
And let me also say, Ronnie Moffat's husband and her family have over the years just been absolutely heroic in making that case known and getting justice to the extent possible. I think that in Chile, a couple of things. Motedo is a poet's poet. He was very stubborn about staying in Valparaiso. He didn't want to be part of any establishment, a literary establishment. He didn't like Santiago, the capital of the city. And so I think that there is some, when you talk about how this would be received in Chile, I think that, you know, there is still in Chile a lot of resistance to, let me put it this way. Pinochet still has, and his regime still have a great deal of support in Chile.
Wow.
Okay, so I'm always hesitant to second guess how any collective would read a body of work, but it would be complicated for Chileans. And I've spent a good bit of time in Chile with Motedo's closest friends, editors, publishers, fellow poets, and his work is extremely important to them and to Zurita and to other poets as well. I think it's pretty obvious why this book couldn't have been published in Chile during the dictatorship, or he felt that he couldn't,
Right.
didn't want to.
I think what I meant in terms of the audience is that, yeah, it's the CIA, it's not us.
I
You
see
know,
what
we didn't experience it, it was somewhere else.
Yeah.
And I think maybe in recent years, we're getting a little more sophisticated in terms of that. But anyway, it's very important work and should be heard. And that's why your translation center is so, I was going to say curious in terms of what it focuses on. I'm saying curious because there's a definite focus. And let's say it is not the erotic poems of Sappho.
Sometimes it was.
What's that?
Sometimes it was.
Sometimes it was. Okay, good. Glad.
I was going to ask the two poets, translators, if you could talk about working with the actual poet, because I think that that's an interesting thing. Collaborations can often be very difficult. It seems like, Jonah, you had a pretty close relationship with your collaborating poet.
Yes, I did. I right from the onset when I got matched with him from Jesse Lee's book, we were on WhatsApp, and we're continued to be on WhatsApp like probably every other day. And we just, now we're friends, and we just talk and say hi and how you doing. And I ask him, but during the translation process, I would because I would have, again, I studied Spanish, and I know a lot of informal colloquial Castellano. I'd been to Argentina, I've been to other countries in South America, but I wasn't too familiar with the slang or, the separate verb conjugation, because they use "vos" a lot instead of, like, "tú" or "usted." So there was different verb conjugations. So I would ask him, I was like, "What do you mean by this phrase? What do you mean by these images?" And so I was able to ask him on WhatsApp. Sometimes we did a few Zoom, but mainly just through text on WhatsApp, and he would clarify some lines for me, and it was amazingly helpful. It was I couldn't have done this, I don't think, as properly as I think I could have without his collaboration and his response. He was very enthusiastic, and he still is.
As an aside, we published Jesse Lee Kercheval's book of poems. I mean, the translations from Uruguay.
Yeah, and I think
I guess I started the romance, huh? Just kidding.
No, but I think you also published Laura Elgin. You published Verses in Ink, and
Yes.
I apologize if I didn't get the title correct. But she was
Escalon.
actually, she was one of the readers for Agua. I
For
reached out to her and she was phenomenal. So
Yeah.
yeah.
I see that Jean Nordhaus is raising her hand. I'm not sure that I can unmute her.
Jean?
Jean, show yourself.
Okay. Okay, I am unmuted, I think. I was just very taken with Jonah's description of sort of the sacrifice that had to be made in the translation of Sorrito Andante, the way overtones and undertones of meaning and double entendres get lost. And then I was listening to Marguerite reading, and those poems are so acute and so the use of the numbers it's like they're like knives. But I wonder whether she had to make similar sacrifices in translating them.
Thank you for that great question. I would say translating Motelo, there were two really big, well, I mean, a number of challenges, but one is that my Spanish is really quite Argentine. And so it was really wonderful to hear Miguel read, because Uruguayos speak very similarly to the way Argentinos do. So that was really wonderful. And it was great of you, Jonah, to have those recordings. I think Motelo is so terse that was a big challenge for me. I think what I had to be really mindful of was his use of alliteration. And so even in the first one, when he says, lea la ley, which is literally, read the law, but I knew I needed that alliteration. So look to the law. I think that there was, his use of alliteration was always really important, as subtle as it could be. And I would also say, I knew to respect his punctuation. His punctuation was super deliberate. And so there are some sentences that go on for a really long time. And there are also some sentences that just end. And so I had to really just give myself to it. It's a very different way of writing than the way I write. And so that was it was a whole new experience, really. Motelo died in 2012, and I have been immeasurably helped by several of his close poet friends. And I'd like to name Luis Andres Rodriguez and Macarena Roca, who has written a dissertation on him, and Montserrat Madariaga, who did the last extended interview with Ennio. So people who knew his work very, very well. Luis is the keeper of his archive. And without that, and without hearing them read the poems, it would have been really hard to have, to just say, okay, here's a perfect example. In number 2, right? Let's appoint the village madman. So in the Spanish, it's que se nombre en visita al loco del pueblo. En visita is a very specific Chilean term, meaning when the judge comes, because historically magistrates traveled. And so just that little phrase, en visita, right, which could be anybody going on a visit, but here you absolutely know you're in a legal, official, bureaucratic context. But I had no way of knowing that. I was just completely thrown off. And I needed somebody to tell me, oh, that means this, right?
Yes, Marguerite, the poems are beautiful, your translations are exquisite, and just the way you articulate everything is phenomenal. But yeah, I mean, in addition to Zorita and Andante, there was also the lead poem from his second collection, La Pieza. So I know La Pieza, and I say it with Spanish. It means the piece, right? So I was like, oh, it's the piece. Okay, I know, Marguerite. I know you would have known this, but I didn't. So I was.
I was laughing at when you almost blushed because you lisped in the Iberian way, and I thought, you don't have to be embarrassed. It's okay.
No, because well, when I visited Argentina, like the first few days, I had no idea what they were saying. To get used to that heavy accent, it's beautiful, it's phenomenal, but it's like it's such a different way, and even like the stress.
Oh,
But anyway, so La Pieza to me meant the piece, right? But then I was talking when Laura, an Uruguayan and other South American authors, I read it and like, no, the La Pieza means the room, like the apartment. And I was like, oh my God, of course. Like now it makes sense. I was like, why is it called the piece? Why is it called the piece? But I never looked La Pieza up in like South American dialect slang. So I guess to sort of, talk about that point. So it's really important for me, at least translating this, to have that cultural reference because I was not as familiar with the sound and the slang of Argentina, Uruguay. Yeah.
Well, it looks like we're close to being out of time. So tune in. Tune in next month on Monday, September 9th, when Café Muse will feature Carol Jennings and Andy Young. And thanks again to Barbara, to our poets, Jonah Colson and Marguerite, I hope I pronounced your name correctly, Fiatovitz. And thanks also for our introductory segment to Michael Davis for his classical guitar and to Dan Marano for his video work. Thanks to our many individual donors who underwrote this event. And finally, to the other members, the entire Café Muse team, myself, along with Ellen Cole, Henry Crawford, Majda Gamal, Renee Garrity, Claire McGough, and of course, WordWorks founder and leader, Karen Alinier. Thank you all for tuning in and hope to see you all next month.